Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if it's the first time you popped along to the channel, well, you're in for a treat because you see it's the A to ZX of the spectrum, which means you're in for some 8-bit microcomputer treats. And it's the letter I, so I wonder what 5 games I've got lined up for us. If you want to find out, then just wait until after the titles. Okay, so first up for the letter I, you know what, I thought we'd go with Inspector Gadget because, well, Inspector Gadget was a much loved character back in the day, and let's face it, what did we want from our much loved characters? We wanted them put onto video games. But in 1987 Beam Software, when they attempted to put Inspector Gadget into a video game, well, they might as well have not bothered because what they put out, well, it was nothing short of despicable. Now before I tear into this game, let's just have a look at the positives, and the only positive I can see in this game is the Inspector Gadget sprite itself. Yes, it's transparent, but you know what, with colour clash in the ZX Spectrum, this was something that all developers had to do at some point or another, and that's where the positives end with Inspector Gadget and the Circus of Fear, because the gameplay itself is so incredibly dull and so incredibly linear. The only thing that you will truly fear playing this game is how much time you've wasted playing it. Now with a character like Inspector Gadget, you would expect a whole host of gadgets to solve puzzles and maybe do some tricky platforming, but no, as I've said, this game is linear. You run from one end of the level to the end of the level, and that's it. Now there are gadgets that you can pick up on the way, such as the Gadget roller skates, but these gadgets are not only few and far between, but they're also, well, they last about 5 seconds at most, so you don't get any real enjoyment out of using them. Now as for the enemy sprites, well, there's a couple. The main enemy sprite, of course, is this small Horus looking creature. Now I don't remember that from any Inspector Gadget cartoons back in the day, but I do remember him from Hungry Horus, Horus Goes Skiing and Horus and the Spiders. So anyone familiar with those games, well, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you don't, look back at the last video in this series, because Horus makes an appearance. Other enemy sprites later on in the game include man-eating plants that sprout out of the ground, again quite transparent, not too badly drawn, but so easy to avoid, and, well, zombie-like creatures that emerge from the ground. Again, I have no idea what they have to do with Inspector Gadget or a Circus of Fear for that matter. This is just another classic example of slapping a license on a game and hoping it'll sell. So my final verdict is quite simple. If you've never played this game, don't. Watch this gameplay, you can see from there all you need to see. There's nothing remotely fun about it in any way, shape or form, and you're not even missing a game that's so bad it's good. This is simply one of those games from the era that you should avoid at all costs. I'll even go as far to say that playing the Flintstones and watching paint dry would be a much better use of your time. Inspector Gadget, get in the bin. Sticking with the licensed games, I thought I'd move on to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, published by US Gold in 1989. And you know what? At least this time they get it right, because if you've got an action license, well, you make an action game, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, well, it's an action platformer. And yes, it is a late ZX Spectrum game, so graphically it's quite stunning for the system. The Indiana Jones sprite itself is well defined, beautifully drawn and quite well animated as well. Of course, the trick of making it monochromatic on the ZX Spectrum, well, it was a must do for big sprites and big areas, because the early colour clash, well, as much as I have a nostalgia for it, it was so much better to see the monochromatic backgrounds and characters without the distraction of the colour clash. The gameplay itself is not too bad either. Yes, it's a bit slow, especially compared with modern platformers, but we are talking about an early 8-bit microcomputer here. But despite that, it still plays really well. Yes, you have to be a bit pixel perfect here and there, but that was the same with all games from the era. There was also some interesting gameplay aspects, such as your torch would run out, making the screen much darker and harder to see. And of course, to make it more difficult to beat the bad guys, well, your whip had an ammo count. Yes, not exactly realistic as whips don't really run out of ammo, but to make the gameplay a little bit more interesting, they threw in that small mechanic just so you couldn't quickly whip your way through every enemy sprite and get to an end of a level. Now most people will know that licensed games and me don't often sit well, but it is nice every now and again, especially from a publisher like US Gold, to put out a licensed game that is actually fun, relevant to the source material, and not just some instant cash grab. Now of course you could play Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in multiple different systems, and to say the Spectrum version was the best, well even I couldn't say that, but at the time it was more than good enough for me and I was happy to own and play this game. So if you do get a chance to play a licensed ZX Spectrum game, well you could do much worse than Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So definitely put on your fedora, grab your whip, load up that tape and play some of this game. It certainly gets a thumbs up from me. Taking a small break from the licensed games, let's move on to, yes, a sports game, and not just a sports game, but football. And yes, my friends across the pond, this is football, because you see, what we do in this game is we control the ball with our feet. But all joking aside, this was one of the very few football, or just to appease the North American audience, soccer games that I actually did enjoy playing. Now International Match Day wasn't the first in the Match Day series, no, Match Day was. And of course they followed it up with Match Day 2, which was pretty much the same game. Now I don't know how much of any of you out there watching this would know the game Subbuteo, but Subbuteo was a tabletop football game where you used little plastic men and flicked them with your fingers to move the ball from player to player and of course score a goal. Now to me this was a video game version of Subbuteo. Now graphically there's absolutely nothing wrong with it for the time, and control, well, it was brutal. Because you see, unlike in modern games, when you move the ball in International Match Day, it doesn't just stick to the next player it hits. No, if the ball is travelling at any speed whatsoever, it will just bounce off that player and move in the opposite direction. So planning your passes, well, you had to be pixel perfect, not only with the pass itself, but the movement of the character you were passing the ball to. Now being an older game, there were some, well, let's just call them glitches that would help you move along with the game. For example, if you were fortunate enough to get the ball to bounce in your head, you could run the ball up the entirety of the park on your head and score a goal without anyone being able to touch you. But for the most part, it was just an extremely tricky football game. But the best part of all was it was two-player. You and your best buddy could sit down at your computer desk, your hand on one side of the keyboard, their hand on the other, and you could go head to head in one of the best couch competition games that you could play at the time. Now it might not be a patch in the FIFA games of today, but without a doubt I could still sit and play this game for a few hours, especially with a friend on the other side of the keyboard. And that's not something I could say about the modern football games that we have. So if you're worried about sports titles from the ZX Spectrum era, well there's nothing to fear, you just need to load in International Match Day, get a good buddy by your side, maybe crack open a beer or two and enjoy some splendid football action. Our penultimate game is going to be another licensed game, but a licensed game with a difference. This is It's a Knockout from Ocean Software in 1986. Now for anyone who doesn't know what It's a Knockout is, you probably know Takeshis Castle, you know, that incredibly funny Japanese game show from 1986. Well, It's a Knockout was a European version. The only difference was it started in 1966, 2 decades before, and it saw teams from all over Europe come and compete in these absolutely ridiculous games. And of course they made a video game of it, because in 1986 they finally had the technology to make a game just as ridiculous as the TV show. Now the game itself was just a collection of fun mini games. For example, you had flying flans, where firstly you would launch a flan over a wall and then you would have to catch it on a plate. If the flans hit the ground however, the ground actually became more slippy, which was an interesting mechanic and quite clever for the time. You also had Harlem Hoppers, where your character was tied to a bungee rope. You had to run towards a camel where someone was rolling balls down the camel. You had to catch it and take it back to score. As simple as that. Then Titanic Drop, where you zip lined off the Titanic and tried to drop in the coloured rings to score points. A Diet of Worms, where grown men on the actual TV show, or men and women, would dress up as ostriches in ridiculous costumes and collect the worms, weren't real worms obviously, and put them in their trays to score points. And as I've said, this was a TV show and fully grown adults would compete in these ridiculous games from 1966. So as you can see, it's just merely a selection of mini games, but it was such fun to play them, considering we used to watch this on Saturday night TV back in the day. And if nothing else, it was a great game to pull out for parties, because it was just a selection of mini games to have a giggle over for an hour or two. So if you get the chance, try It's a Knockout. And more than that, why don't you see if you can see some of the old TV shows, because to be honest with you, they're just as fun, and it's kinda nice to see where the Japanese got the idea for Takeshis Castle, because this stuff was happening in Europe long before it was happening in Japan. So remember, it's a hoot, it's a holler, it's a scream, it's a knockout. And for the older UK audience, the Belgians are down again. For our last game in the letter I, we're going to hit up the arcades and have a look at the port of Akari Warriors from Elite in 1987. Now, Akari Warriors was a classic. It is a classic, could still play it today. Well, on the arcade I could. When it came to the Spectrum version, well, they tried their best, but they just couldn't quite pull off what was necessary for the game. Sure, most of the gameplay elements were all there. It was a top-down, frantic-paced run and gun, lots of enemies shooting at you, you shooting lots of enemies, blowing up bases with your grenades, and even getting into the tank so you could power through some of the tougher levels. Where the Spectrum version fell down, however, was definitely in the visuals. Now don't get me wrong, it's not bad for a Spectrum game, but for a game as fast-paced as Akari Warriors, everything needs to be crystal clear, and to avoid colour clash, well, they had to go for the old transparent trick. In other words, your character was the same colour of whatever background they were on, and unfortunately for this, it meant sometimes you just couldn't see your sprite or the enemy sprites. Now, I'm not saying don't give this a chance on the ZX Spectrum, you should definitely give it a chance, but bear in mind, much like Commando, this was so much tougher than on the arcades, and purely from the point that it was really hard to see what you were trying to do. But at the end of the day, it was also another great attempt to port over an arcade game to an 8-bit microcomputer. And the fact it is actually playable, well, that's quite astounding anyway. And despite the difficulty that the visuals cause it, it is still a playable game and still a very playable port of Akari Warriors. And purely because Akari Warriors is such an important game in arcade history, well, it's a must own anyway. So if you do get the chance, give Akari Warriors on the ZX Spectrum a chance. Yes, you'll probably find it quite tough and frustrating at times, but on the other hand, if it was too easy, it just wouldn't be fun either. So Akari Warriors, a splendid attempt, and well worth a few hours of your own playtime. So there you go, my friends, another selection of 8-bit masterpieces. Well, okay, they weren't all masterpieces, but they were all ZX Spectrum games. They were all in the letter I, and they're all 8-bit microcomputer classics, shall we say? And if you want to talk about any of these games, then drop it down in the comments. Whether you played them in the past, whether you wish you'd played them in the past, whether they remind you of games that you play now, anything at all, drop it in the comments. I love getting back to you guys. Also, if you enjoyed this content, then think about throwing me a little thumbs up, because one, it makes a difference to the channel, but two, it makes a great big difference to me, because I just love to know that you guys enjoy the content I put out. And in speaking of the content I put out, well, the subscription button. Always there, always free, and you'll always be able to see whatever random nonsense I've posted next. And until next time, well, you could watch some of this guy here. This is Zanoni Revived, and if you like 8-bit classics, this channel is definitely one to watch, so pop along there as soon as you can. So, thank you again for watching, and until next time, cheerio!